Mm, damn, Gina. Hello, and welcome to another video. My name is Heather, and as always, I'm reading with a vengeance, and I hope you are too. If you're new to my channel, very warm welcome to you. If you are an OG and keep coming back, I very much appreciate you. I hope everybody's doing well. I don't really have any life news to report. I usually do. I can tell you that I am just now getting over a chest cold, so that's always fun to talk about. My husband's laid up in bed because his back went out, and that's a bummer. But for the most part, everything is kind of business as usual here. I mean, we've been busy at work. That's just about it. While the holidays are usually a really busy time for most people, it's usually a quiet time for my husband and I because our families live in different states, including Jason. Well, Jason's kids live about an hour and a half away, but they're spending Christmas with their grandparents in Mississippi. And so most of the time it's just Jason and I. And yeah, we just have kind of a quiet evening, and we'll usually cook something good for dinner, watch a Christmas movie or something like that. And it'll be pretty quiet. The bummer of it is even though we don't usually go through all the things that a lot of people do to prepare for the holidays, we still get caught up in the traffic and the busyness. I mean, just a quick trip to the drugstore to pick up a prescription or just something that we need for the house or whatever, it is a journey and it is a thing. And we have to deal with crowds and traffic and all that kind of stuff. So that's kind of a bummer, but that's what everybody has to go through, right? So that's really kind of the thing that makes me a little scroogey around this time of year, is just all the hubbub, you know? I, for one, am looking forward to the first of the year. But anyways, today I'm here to talk to you about the books that I read in the first half of December. I have an interesting mix of books to talk to you about today. I have a book that I was very much looking forward to. I have a book that has been very, very much hyped in the bookish world. I have a book that is a modern classic. And I have a book that I loved so much, it is the exact reason why I wait until the very end of the year before I make my favorites of the year video. I would say I didn't really dislike any of the books that I read so far, but I will talk about them in the order that I liked them, starting with the least first. The first book I'm going to talk to you about is First Lie Wins by Ashley Elston. This is an ARC, and of course I picked it up at work. Like I said, I didn't dislike any of the books that I read this month. This one just fell a little flat for me towards the end. This one follows Evie Porter, and she is a woman with kind of a checkered past. She is kind of recruited by this mystery person to do kind of special ops, mostly illegal things. She's kind of the CIA for the underground. She's hired by, to her, unnamed clients through her mystery employer, who she refers to as Mr. Smith, to do certain jobs for these clients. They could be anything from finding a missing person or stealing high-priced art to reclaim it for the supposed rightful owner, stuff like that. And a lot of times she's put in a situation where she's kind of in an undercover situation. She will implant herself in people's lives and kind of get her way in that way before she's given the actual job of what she's meant to do. She is kind of put in this town and set up to meet her next mark, who happens to be Orion Sumner. Evidently, he runs kind of an underground black market business, and she is supposed to infiltrate her way into his life to try to get more information about his business. So she does that, but she ends up having a relationship with this person, and she starts to develop feelings for Ryan. And of course, her life gets more complicated and the story goes from there. It's told from first person perspective, from Evie's point of view. And it goes back and forth to the past, back to the present. And when she goes back in the past, she goes all the way back to when she is a teenager being raised by her mom, who is ill. And she'll talk about that for a little bit, and then it'll come back to the present, and then it'll go back, and it'll be a couple of years after that where she gets into trouble with the law, and that's when she is approached by Mr. Smith, and how she is hired by him. And then it'll come back to the present. And then when she goes back in the past, it'll be a couple of years past that to her first job, and so on. And she talks about certain jobs and specific jobs where things have gone wrong, and she starts to develop a mistrust for Mr. Smith. And then she learns that Mr. Smith is kind of putting together a plan to get rid of her. So things are just all kinds of complicated for Evie. I immediately found myself engaged in this story. It's pacey, it's easy to read, it's easy to understand what's happening. I just feel like there were some questions left unanswered. Why was she recruited, and who was this person, and why did he pick Evie? Those types of things. There was a good level of suspense in the story that I appreciated, but ultimately I found really this story a little bit far-fetched, especially how it ended, which I won't spoil. But if you want something that's pacey, suspenseful, a little bit of action, a little bit of romance, a very little bit of romance, you might enjoy this. But like I said, I didn't dislike it. It was just okay for me. First Light Winds comes out January 9th. So if that interests you, then you could look for it then. So the next book I'm going to talk to you about is the book that has been very much hyped over the internet, and it just so happens that it won the Goodreads Choice Awards for Best Fiction of 2023. Yes, I read Yellowface by R.F. Kuang. Was this book overhyped? I believe it was. Did I dislike it? No, it was a decent story. It was engaging and it had very strong themes, which I'll talk about in just a minute. Winner of the Goodreads Choice Awards for Best Fiction of the Year. Let me just have a look-see on the other books that it was up against. Okay, I understand Goodreads, it's a popularity contest. I get it. But I'm looking at these other books, and I have only read one other book that it was up against, and that is The Collected Regrets of Clover. And I would have to say I did enjoy that one better than Yellowface. I've heard so many good things about Big Swiss, Burnham Wood, Tom Lake by Ann Patchett. I don't know, the whole popularity thing, it's just kind of bleh. But if you don't know, and I'm sure most of you do know what the story of Yellowface is, this follows June Hayward, and she is a writer, but her first attempt at a novel flopped. Her friend, Athena Liu, went entirely in a different direction. Her career soared right out of the gates of college. She had a bestseller, she's got an MFA, people are talking to her about making a movie out of her book. She's a literary star. And this whole story is told from June's point of view, and you can kind of tell that there is jealousy there. But Athena is her friend, and she kind of rides that balance of being jealous and trying to be supportive, and also trying to remain a friend of Athena and kind of enjoy the glow of her success. So there is a question of just how good of friends they are. And then one night when they're celebrating in Athena's home, her latest success, she dies from a freak accident, and June witnesses it. And June also takes a manuscript that Athena, her latest manuscript that she's written, and takes it with her when she leaves the apartment after all is said and done. And then she makes her own edits and passes it off as her own. Oh, and just as a side tidbit, Athena is Asian American and June is not. And the story that Athena has written is about the Chinese role in World War II. And of course, once it is published by June, there is question of cultural appropriation and why does this white woman think that she can write this story from the Chinese point of view. The story goes from there and it gets complicated for June. People start to question her all the way to the point that there are a few people who are doubting that June even wrote this story. So I understand this is satirical, and I think Kuang did a really good job with that. There were a couple of themes also that I thought were really well done with this story. The way somebody can be completely destroyed and torn down via social media, that was addressed in this story. It was handled very well. You can just see how easy it is that certain comments can be made on a certain platform and it can be commented on and reshared, and then that comment just becomes part of the norm of what we see, and then it becomes fact somehow. And it's just such a dangerous, slippery slope that can happen to somebody, to anybody, really. And I thought Kwong handled that whole phenomenon beautifully. I think Yellowface was somewhat marketed as a thriller, and there is a small thriller aspect because June starts to get threats from an anonymous person via email and social media saying, I know you stole that manuscript. I know you didn't write it. You better come clean or else. And I thought that was an okay direction for it to go. I mean, it definitely kept you interested. And then there was an also direction the story went where June thought she was seeing the ghost of Athena. And at first I was a little disappointed because I thought, I don't think the paranormal would be a good direction to take this story. But really, it was about how all the pressure of the social media attacks and the question of her integrity and all that, and just the stress of it all really got to June. And that's why she started to think that she saw the ghost of Athena. And you really follow June as she completely unravels. One of the things I found frustrating is she never once, I don't think, felt guilty about what she did, because she did put her own spin on it. She edited it in a way that made the finished product more hers than Athena's. But the thing that is undeniable is that the initial idea was 100% Athena's. And she never once expressed any guilt about stealing that idea. But I think that was the point of the story. I enjoyed it. I didn't love it. I thought it was a decent story. I thought it was a good story. And like I said, I thought it was a really good commentary on what social media can do and the whole conversation on cultural appropriation. And I won't get into what side of the fence I fall on with that, but I thought the conversation was good and I thought Kwong handled it quite well in this story. But yeah, best fiction of the year, I wouldn't agree with that. Overhyped, definitely. But it is a good story. I mean, the other thing that is covered in this story is what happens in the publishing industry. I have no idea about anything about the publishing industry. And it was just very interesting, the steps that are taken to get a novel published, and even all the things after the agreement is made to publish a novel, all the things that have to happen legal wise and research wise and fact checking and all this kind of thing that has to happen. That was news to me, and that was interesting to read about. So I will say that I would recommend this book for sure, but be careful going into it knowing all the hype that surrounds it. But it is a good story on its own. The next book I read is the modern classic that I was talking about, and that is All Quiet on the Western Front by Eric Maria Remarque. I can't remember why I picked this up. Completely escapes me. I want to say that I picked it up at a secondhand store. I don't know, but it intrigued me. It is one of the first stories that has been published about war that doesn't glorify war. There have been several movies made, none of which I've seen. And after reading this, I specifically will not be watching any movie adaptations of this. And that's not because this wasn't a good book. This was a good book. It was too good. This is based on a personal account of the author's time spent in World War I and the absolute horror that World War I was. The thing that struck me about this book is that it is written in such a way that you absolutely get a very clear sense of the horrors that happened, the violence, the despair, the death, the absolute terror. The vividness was absolutely there without it being just gratuitous violence being written down on the page. This is actually a very quiet novel. From the point of view of your soldier, I think his name is Paul. He's got his friends who before the war they were classmates, and they were encouraged to enlist to go to war by their schoolmaster. And of course it was glorified, go and fight for your country, be a patriot, get all the glory. and what they got was something quite different. One of the things that I thought was really interesting about this story is he talks about how, kids are sent to war. They're 18 years old. By legal standards, they're an adult, but they're kids. And they go to war and they see all this terrible stuff, and they're made to do all this terrible stuff, and they're made to be responsible for these very adult things. And you have these kids that the most significant event in their lives so far is this war. So if they survive it, that's like what they base the rest of their life on, is their experience in this war. Where if you think about it on the flip side, when you have older people who, like the officers who go to war, they maybe had careers back home, they have wives, they have children, they have these other significant events, so their entire life isn't held up to the war to compare to. I don't know if that makes sense, but I thought that was a very interesting way to look at it, how just one of the many, many ways it's ridiculous to send 18-year-olds to war. There was a couple of scenes that just really got to me that I just wanted to share with you. And if I haven't mentioned it before and you don't know, Paul is actually a German soldier. And so this is the point of view of the Germans in World War One. And Paul is standing duty at a prison camp, and the prison camp had Russian soldiers in the prison camp. And Paul was kind of thinking to himself that, if the circumstances were anything other than what they are, these are men that he could be friends with. That these Russian soldiers are his enemy only because some nameless person up in government signed a paper with a bunch of other government officials and said, these people are your enemy. So it was really kind of commentary on blind nationalism that just causes humans to do such terrible things to other humans. And then the other scene that really got to me was they were in the trenches and they were getting bombarded with shells and bombs, and they heard the screaming of the horses that they used during the war. And it was a horrible, horrible scene. And one of the soldiers, who was a farmer before he went into the war, made the comment of it is the vilest baseness that they use horses in war. And it's interesting this comment is made because you're made to think, well, gosh, what about these young boys who are sent to war? I just thought that was very poignant and meaningful, and it really got to me. So this story just describes the extreme mental and physical trauma that these German soldiers endured during World War One, not just during the war, but the detachment that they faced once they re-entered civilian life. And actually, I'll just leave you with the preface that I thought was pretty profound. It says, this book is to be neither an accusation nor a confession, and least of all an adventure. For death is not an adventure to those who stand face to face with it. It will try simply to tell of a generation of men who, even though they may have escaped shells, were destroyed by the war. So yeah, this is really not a memorial to the 8 million men who died in the war, but really talks about how the tragedy was truly the destruction of the survivors who were unable to re-enter society. Really, really well done. I see why it's a modern classic. I would definitely recommend this, but it will leave you feeling quite empty. The next book I read was The Book of Fire by Christy Lefdary. I was able to get my hands on an ARC from work, and I was super excited about reading it before it gets published in January for you guys. I was specifically excited about this one because I read The Beekeeper of Aleppo, and it's one of my all-time favorite books. It's the only other book by Lefdary that I have read. I want to read her other stuff. I really enjoy her writing. I thought, well, if I'm going to read something else by her, it might as well be her newest one coming out. I very much enjoyed this book. Did I love it as much as Beekeeper of Aleppo? No, but I really did enjoy it, and it had very similar themes to Beekeeper. This one takes place in Greece, and you're following Irene, her husband Tasso, and their, I want to say 9-year-old daughter, Chara. And they live in a small village. Tasso is an artist, he's a painter, And Irene is, I believe she is a musician. And one day they are forced, along with everybody else in their village, to flee as a wildfire comes through the forest that is by their village and ravages everything. And everybody has to basically escape by jumping in the ocean. At first, when I was reading this, I thought it was inspired by the Maui fires, but then I realized, well, then she only would have had a couple of months to write it. But there's an author note that follows the book where she talks about she was in Greece in 2017 when the wildfires happened at that time. And as we know, there's been several wildfires in Greece that have happened since then. But this story was inspired by the ones that happened in 2017. So the fire happens, and Irene and her family survive, but not unscathed. Both her daughter and her husband are badly burned, as with many other people in the village. And many people have lost their lives. Many more people have lost their homes, including Irene's family. And it becomes known that a local rich man who was a developer and wanted to build a hotel near the village deliberately set the fire. He was only meaning to do a controlled burn, but it got out of hand. And it ends up with these horrible and tragic results. And one day, not long after the fire, Irene goes for a walk, and she comes across this man sitting at the base of a tree, and he has a rope around his neck. He is still alive, but he's struggling, and Irene doesn't know what to do, and she runs away. And ultimately, she comes back and she calls the authorities. And this isn't a spoiler, but he ultimately dies. It is unknown for a little bit of time whether he committed suicide or if people of the town found him and strung him up. The story follows Irene's struggle to reconcile her actions. Should she have stayed and helped him? Should she have called the authorities sooner? It's also a story of Irene getting her family back together. Her husband has not really spoken since the fire, and her daughter is struggling as well. And this is really just kind of a story of this family putting the pieces back together after this fire. I did enjoy this story. Christy Lefteri's writing is beautiful. She has this way of describing the environment and nature and everything around the characters in such a way where you don't feel like it's too wordy, but at the same time, she is creating this movie that is going on in your head. And I really appreciate that. I also like how she includes the arts in her characters' lives, whether it be music or painting or something like that, and how it affects their healing process. I think that is just a beautiful thing that she includes in her stories, at least the two stories that I have read so far. And I definitely intend to read all of her other works. I don't think she has an incredibly long backlist, but even though it didn't quite meet the standard of The Beekeeper of Aleppo, I did enjoy this story and I absolutely would recommend it for you. And finally, my favorite of the month so far. This is the reason why I wait until all of my reading is done for the year before I compile my list of favorites of the year. Because had I already recorded it, I would have been kicking myself because this next book is definitely going to make it on that list. The book I'm talking about is The Boy and His Dog at the End of the World by C.A. Fletcher. You guys, I love this book so much. So much. This is a post-apocalyptic, I guess, dystopia, sci-fi, coming-of-age adventure novel. We are, I think, a couple of 100 years into the future after an event known as the Gelding has happened, and our population on the planet went from 8 million down to 8,000. So things are primitive. There's no electricity. There's nothing of the present day technology or anything like that. There are small pockets of communities all across the planet, and you're following Grizz, who is a young boy. I want to say he's around 14 or 15 years old, and he lives with his brother and older sister and his parents on the coast, I believe, of Scotland. They're just living their lives day to day, and a stranger comes on a boat one day. He comes across as friendly and wants to make a trade. I forget what the sailor wants to trade of his own, but what he wants is Grizz's dogs, specifically his female dog, because, and I won't get into too many specifics, but female dogs are very highly coveted in this world because of, well, because of things that you would have to read in the story. Female dogs are very highly coveted. Anyways, Grizz says no, she's not for sale, she's not up for trade. Things happened, and it turns out that this stranger ends up stealing Grizz's dog. Jess, I think is her name, and takes off in his boat. And the next morning, Grizz discovers this has happened, and he ends up taking his father's boat, setting off after him. And the story follows Grizz's adventure and journey to get his dog back. And he ends up taking his male dog, Jep. Is it Jip or Jep? I think it's Jip. Yeah, it's got Jip and Jess. Yes. So Grizz sets off with Jip to get his dog back, and all kinds of things happen. And there are two pretty significant twists in the story that I never saw coming that were absolutely fantastic. I love this book so much. I was on the edge of my seat the whole time. There's humor, there is suspense, there's terror. It's just a fantastic story. I highly recommend it. It was one of those stories that was just way better than I thought it was going to be. And of course, I was worried because, dogs are significant characters in the story. I was wondering if I was going to regret reading it because of something bad happening to the dogs. And I'm not going to spoil it here. All I can say is I loved this book. And if you want to know if something bad happens to the dog, or let's just out with it, if you want to know if the dog dies, you can send me a message and I'll tell you. But I will just say it was an excellent story, so much fun, great twist. I'm just bummed because there's only one other book that this author has written. And it's just kind of a bummer that when you read something that you love so much, you want to read everything that they've written. And I have one book on his backlist to read. Oh well, what can you do? I loved it. Highly recommend. So that is it. Those are the books that I've read so far in the month of December. Have you guys read any of these books? What did you think of them? I would love to know. Or you can just say hi down in the doodly-doo. If you're still watching at this point, please consider giving that like button a boop, and a subscribe would be wonderful. Thank you, thank you, thank you so much for watching, and I will see you next time.